Hi, and welcome back to the Mob Mentality Show. My co-host is Austin Chadwick, and today we have Mike Bowler to talk to us about a different approach to facilitating mob programming sessions, neuroscience of psychological safety, and team flow states and brainware of activity during mobbing. So, Mike, would you like to first introduce yourself, and then we can get into the discussion?
Sure. I originally come from a developer background, so I've been writing code for a long time. In the late 90s, I got frustrated watching projects fail. We'd go and we'd put all this effort into projects. They wouldn't be what the customer wanted. They were late. They were over budget. And I went looking for a better way. And what I found was the XP community. It was full of people that were just like me. And so for the last 25 years, I've been helping teams get better, still doing a lot of technical practices, and over time, adding mobbing to my repertoire. I've been doing pairing for 25 years. I've been doing mobbing for about a decade now.
Awesome, awesome. Well, it's great to have you on the show. We can jump right into it. So a different approach to facilitating mob programming sessions. So, what's your approach? How did you get there?
Well,
Yeah.
it's interesting because first started hearing about mobbing through things that Woody and others were talking about.
Mhm.
And I thought I was doing exactly what everybody else was doing. And then I went to the first mob programming conference in Boston, and I started listening to other people and what they were talking about, and I discovered that what I was doing was not what they were doing. And it was a bit of a shock to me. Why I thought I was doing exactly the same things that everybody else was doing. But I've continued my things the way I do it, and I've tried the way other people do it, and I still prefer my way. So there's just a couple of subtle things that are different. So first of all, I ask for a larger block of time up front. I ask for 2 full days right up front. And I know that when I talked about this to other people who facilitate mobbing, they were freaked out by the fact that I was asking for a lot of time with a team right up front because they were asking for 2 hours, maybe 3 hours. And I'm saying, no, I want 2 full days.
Hmm.
And so I get into that. The other thing is that I don't have a dedicated navigator position. Whereas most people who do this, they say that we've got a dedicated driver, a dedicated navigator, and then everybody else. And in my model, it's driver and everybody else navigates.
Hmm.
And so I give the analogy of us driving a car and one being more tactical and one being more strategic, but I want everybody jumping in all the time. And so the most common complaint or criticism that I hear from other coaches is, well, if you do that, then everybody's going to be talking all over each other and it's going to be nasty and it's going to be a bad experience. And well, it often is on the first day. But by the second day, we're past all that. The second day of the experience, we've passed storming entirely. We're now into norming. We're starting to get really good behavior. We're starting to get things delivered. It's radically different. So, yes, the first day can be rough where we're talking over each other. And if all you allocated was 2 hours for those teams, it's going to be a bad experience. But
Hmm.
because I've got the 2 full days, I ensure that by the time they get to the end of the second day, we've got a really positive experience. Part of that also is that I find that with almost every team that I mob with, um, we can get to complete from start to done in about a day and a half. Almost every team I can count. I've done hundreds of teams, facilitated mobbing with hundreds of teams, and I can count on one hand how many teams could not get something done in a day and a half, in the full 2 days that we've got.
Hmm.
Ironically, today was one of those times. We just added another one because we got to a particularly intractable problem with a team
Yeah.
that I was mobbing with for the first time, and by the end of the second day, we had not completed the piece of work. But that is so rare in my experience.
Yeah.
Nice.
Well, so yeah, I certainly share that feeling. I think we, generally speaking, even in a new mob, when I think back to when I was first mobbing, it was certain issues and problems got solved faster than generally you'd see with just a person by themselves. And but yeah, it's pretty. Those hairy problems are something that a mob, new or existing, can struggle with for sure.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Nice.
So how has it? I guess trying the different ways, like, what other comparisons or how did it affect you when you were uh, doing that experimentation?
Well, tried all kinds of things.
Hmm.
And we tried longer rotation times. We've tried Well, I'll tell you in a moment about the expert, but we've tried all different things, and over time, things have just evolved into what I end up with. A lot of times early on, we wouldn't get stuff done or we wouldn't have the greatest experience. But these days, when I do it, we're still having a great experience, even if they choose not to continue with mobbing after they've done with me.
Hmm.
They still say, this was a great use of our time. We really enjoyed it. We came together. We learned from each other. We had a lot of fun, which, although fun is not the goal, if we're not having fun, we're probably not going to get to the goal.
Right.
So we're having fun. We're getting a lot done. We're learning from each other. It's been a fabulous experience. And then some of them say, but we don't want to do it again. All right. That's up to you.
Very
But I
interesting.
hinted at the expert, and that's another one of my rules is that when we're coming into this mobbing, if we discover that there's some one person on the team who is a clear expert on the thing we're doing, I kick them out of the rotation. They're not allowed to drive. And I do this because I had one client where I went in where I didn't know they had an expert. And this was a time that we were mobbing in person. So this was before COVID. And we were rotating through and we got to the expert, the one person who knew this code base better than anybody else. And the moment his hands touched the keyboard, it was like watching synchronized swimming. Everybody pulled their cell phones out and started checking their messages.
Right.
So now I hit that one directly head on. Is there somebody here who knows this code better than anybody else? Okay, you're off the rotation until we get to a part of the code where you're no longer the expert. And now you can come back in and maybe we're kicking somebody else out.
Right. Yeah. So generally, if it's kind of like an over navigation thing, and sometimes that might be because a team might not already be mobbing, you might have these like significant knowledge silos, and then they'll just kind of go off on their own. But like one thing I think when I'm talking to a team who hasn't mobbed before, or like just at a conference or something, often I'll say, everybody should be speaking a roughly equal amount of time. And if somebody's dominating, then that can be a kind of a smell in that situation. Um, but also a lot of they haven't had that opportunity to circulate that information, and so
Mm-hmm.
it's fascinating to see how it's like everybody becomes hyper dependent on one person, and that dependency is very harmful. Right.
Yes, absolutely. One
Yeah.
of my interesting experiences with mobbing was a team that I got started where the one clear expert on everything just happened to be on vacation that week.
Yeah.
And so we ended up mobbing, and they learned so much about the product that everybody had never learned before because they'd always just leaned on the expert.
Mhm.
The expert would do it for them. And so all of a sudden they're starting to learn about what each other does and what's going on. And it's often shocking. You do what when you're testing the product, or you do what when you're doing the database stuff? I don't understand. So there's usually a lot of eye-opening experiences because when I'm mobbing with teams, I expect that you're typically mobbing with groups who have done this before. For me, this is usually their first experience. They might think they've done mobbing before, but they've not done anything like what I'm introducing.
Mhm.
So this is a whole new experience for them. They
Yeah.
don't know what to expect. And it can be rough on that first day. But by the second day, we're just screaming through the work. And usually by the end of the second day, they're asking if they can do a third.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. For sure. Yeah. And I think, yeah, I have several thoughts, but I guess following the stack methodology here, the last thing you said jumped out at me where the benefits of mobbing while the expert is on vacation, I think is a very freeing thing if you find yourself to be an expert on a team, because you're like, it's good for me to take a vacation. They're going to
Oh, yeah.
experience good things that they wouldn't be able to experience unless I was gone.
Hmm.
And I'll say it before I know Chris will. Same benefit for switching teams, right? So if you switch teams for a while, temporarily or permanently, you can kind of cause that to happen. And I think it's like a safe way to experiment without the expert there and cause that learning without a catastrophic loss, like that person left forever and you can never talk to them again. Right. Yeah. And so,
It does mean that the mob goes slower, though. So
Yes, they
that
do.
that is something to be aware of. I wouldn't have
Right.
chosen to have done it when the expert wasn't present. It just so happened that we set the time, he wasn't there.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, another thing that jumped out to me was your style. So I'll just try to summarize it as the mini navigator's pattern, right? You still have one solo driver and a long duration of mobbing as opposed to, hey, let's do fizz buzz for 30 minutes or an hour, right? What's very interesting to me is that is very similar to our visitor program. Different in many ways because in that case, it's a, let's say, two to three people who are experienced with mobbing and then someone joining
Hmm.
the mob who's inexperienced with mobbing. But similar, and that's just the without like predefining it as a script. Most times I've observed our visiting program where someone will come mob with us. They'll mob typically for the whole day. And since I think it's just because the mini navigators pattern is the default for a lot of our mobs is kind of like their, standard operating procedure, even though they might operate differently in certain cases. The visitor just kind of flows into that style. And you're right. I would say 95% of the visits, the problem you're talking about, where people are talking over each other and it's kind of chaotic,
Hmm.
gets overcome very quickly. And then 5% of visits, it might take the full day before the new team, storms and norms with especially if it's a visitor who has a lot to say,
Hmm.
then finding the flow again of not talking over each other without a strict navigation does take time, and I guess I can see why you would want more than an hour to figure that out, right? Because
Yeah.
if you only had an hour, you might start to figure it out and then be like, okay, bye, see you guys. We won't mob again for another week, and you'll never kind of reach the goodness.
Yeah,
So,
we start to develop a lot of comfort with each other. Another thing that I didn't mention is that on the first day, I want everybody on the team, not just the developers. And so on that first day, I'm only asking the developers to take a turn on keyboard. But by the second day, I'm asking everybody, the scrum masters, the product owners, the testers, everybody, would you like to have a turn on keyboard? I'm not forcing it. But by the second day, you would be astounded, or maybe you wouldn't be astounded, other people are, at how many people, like product owners and scrum masters who have never written a line of code in their life before, would like a turn on keyboard.
nice. Yeah.
Just because now they know. The first day they feel uncomfortable, but by the
Yeah.
second day they know the team has their back.
Yeah. 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 I think it's one of those things that seems incredibly daunting until you drive one turn and you're like, oh, that wasn't so bad. I could do that all day.
Hmm.
Right. Like we've even had students who have very little coding experience, super tentative at the start of the visit. And then by the end of the day, they're navigating a feature or a bug fix or
Hmm.
something with confidence, on production code. And so, yeah, I think it's one of those things that seems completely backwards and ridiculous until you've seen it. And so,
What does I often introduce mobbing as if this is the first time you've heard this, this may sound like the stupidest idea ever. And believe me, it works.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, yeah, maybe it's a good time to jump into the neuroscience of psychological safety and mobbing. And
Okay.
how
So
can
perfect.
we,
So I
yeah.
talk a lot about neuroscience and psychology because I'm very fascinated about why we do the things we do. How do we motivate people? How do we get the best results out of people? Why do we often work against our own best interests? So I dive a lot into this stuff. But also from our context, we talk an awful lot about psychological safety, but it's platitudes. It's good, do more of it. And we don't actually talk about the concrete things. Well, what does it actually mean in your brain when we're not feeling psychologically safe, and why is it a bad thing? So I want to talk a little bit about some of the neuroscience as we go through this, but also relate it back to how mobbing actually helps with most of the elements that go into the safety model that I'm going to introduce. So this is a model. It spells out, it's an acronym, spells out safety, which is very convenient. They had to stretch a bit to make some of the letters fit, but it does spell out the word safety. So the S in safety is security, which should really be called consistency, but it's security. It's this notion that we can predict what's coming. From an evolutionary perspective, we have evolved to be astounding prediction engines because it turns out that for long-term survival, It's not enough to be able to react to a danger around us. We need to be able to predict that danger. We need to be able to anticipate where something is going to come from. And we see this across the spectrum. This is not just humans, this is all animals. This is even single cell organisms can anticipate what's going to happen in the environment around them. We have no idea how a single cell organism can do that, but we can observe the fact that it is actually anticipating what's coming. So to have psychological safety, we need to have some way of reasonably anticipating what's going to happen in our environment. And if everything is changing all the time, if there's layoffs, if people are uncertain, I don't know if I'm on this team, I'm on that team, then I feel unsafe because I can't realistically predict what's coming. But if I know that I'm on a stable team and we've got regular work that's coming to us, the work is going to change. But I have some sense that the team has got my back, that we're going to be working in this way. I've got that consistency, and that consistency helps me feel safer.
Nice.
I suppose I should have mentioned, even before I got into the actual acronyms of this, when we are not feeling psychologically unsafe, the neuroscience definition of psychological safety is when we have access to the prefrontal cortex, which is that part of our brain that does higher level rational thinking. So if we want to be thinking at our best, which of course is what we do as development teams, we need to be thinking. We're doing a thinking job, not a lifting job. And so we want to be thinking at our best. We need our prefrontal cortex active. And that's why we need psychological safety.
Mm.
So when we start to feel unsafe, if I can't predict what's going on in my environment, I feel less safe. My prefrontal cortex is inhibited. I'm not only feeling bad, but I'm also thinking poorly. Because my prefrontal cortex is not there, I'm not doing the best job. So if I'm starting to write some code to implement something, I don't have all of my capability there because part of my brain is actually shut down.
Mm.
So moving along to A. A
Yeah,
is
please, please.
in the
Yeah.
safety model is autonomy. Autonomy, we have to be able to feel that we have the ability to make choices for ourselves. And so if we don't have autonomy, if we don't have any say in what's going on, then we feel less safe. Mobbing, again, helps with autonomy because the team is starting to make decisions for the team. It's not just that my team lead told me what to do or my manager told me what to do. The team is making their own decisions. Now, I know a lot of people, when I talk about autonomy, will say, well, I can point at this person over here who just wants to be told what to do. And, there's always some person that just tell me what to do and we'll be fine. Well, those people are feeling not enough of the S. They don't have enough predictability in their environment. They don't have enough security. They don't know what's going on and able to anticipate, and therefore they just want to be told what to do. But once they feel safe, now they need autonomy to be able to make their own decisions. Again, if we don't have that autonomy, we feel less safe. Our prefrontal cortex is inhibited. We're not doing our best work anymore. So then we move around to the F in safety. So it's security, autonomy, fairness is the F. And we must perceive that the environment is fair. And interestingly, it doesn't have to be fairness directed towards me. I just have to perceive fairness in the environment. So if I see that the two of you are behaving in a way that is unfair for one of you, then that makes me feel less safe. I don't even have to be impacted by this. I feel less safe because I see you interacting in a way that is unfair to one of you. So we need to feel that sense of fairness. Mobbing doesn't directly help with this one, although it does indirectly help because we're leveling the playing field. We're all working in a common, consistent way. We have reliability. We build in a lot of that fairness that comes along with that. So mobbing is helping in a less direct way. Then we have E. E is esteem. It's all about social standing. It's how we perceive ourselves and others perceive us. From an evolutionary perspective, the person that got kicked out of the tribe tended to die. And so this is all about our social status. Do we feel that the team has our back? Well, in a mob, typically the team does have our back. We tend to develop trust very quickly within the team, although trust is a separate letter in the safety model. Esteem is all built on top of that trust as well. So how do I feel? Do I feel like I'm just like I'm really a member of the mob, that the mob has got my back, that everything's good? Or do I feel that I'm the loner, I'm off on my own doing things? So esteem. Then we do get around to T, which is trust. We need to have trust. Interestingly, this one, like fairness, is not bidirectional. And as long as I feel that you trust me, I feel safer. I don't need to trust you, which is odd. But the mob, of course, builds up trust. I have seen few techniques that build trust among people faster than actively working on the work together. So mobbing builds that trust incredibly fast. And so when people say we need to build trust in the team, mobbing is my number one go-to.
Mm.
Start there. Do some work together. Actually build a thing together. So we need to get that trust. If we don't have trust, or if I don't feel that other people trust me, I feel less safe. My prefrontal cortex is inhibited. The last letter in the safety model is Y, which is sort of a catch-all. It stands for you. And it's all of those things that are individual and unique to people. So it's your own cognitive bias, it's your own approach, your own backstory, past trauma you might have had. It's all of these things that are unique to you that really aren't true for everybody else. So we've got these 5 main buckets of security, autonomy, fairness, esteem, and trust. And then we've got this catch-all that is you. But all of these things get affected to some level with mobbing, which is why I felt it was an appropriate thing to bring up here, because the mob really does help build all of those things so that we feel safer. And when we feel safer, we're actually doing better, higher quality work because we have full access to our brain activity.
Nice, nice. Well, yeah, it's I found this very fascinating because it was just kind of a observation after mobbing versus trying other ways of working, whether that's completely siloed waterfall or being on the quote unquote same team and like a scrum team, but it's still kind of individual coding or work that gets passed around, you kind of like over the wall of the cubicle, so to speak. And I think just experientially, in the spirit of just sharing, it was basically, wow, psychological safety seems to grow way faster when I mob than it does any of these other ways I've tried. But I've never really okay, breaking down exactly why. I think for me personally, the trust thing stood out to me a lot in this breakdown that maybe with less precision. But seeing the full acronym break it down in all these different ways, it really helps see why certain environments are conducive to psychological safety and certain environments are not. One thing that jumped out to me was the fair is, yeah, to see the team interacting in a fair way increases psychological safety. And I think I've noticed this, especially if you have maybe a larger mob, maybe let's just say 4 people, and one person's newer, even if they're not super active navigation in the mob for, let's say, the first hour, but they observe, let's say, me and Chris mob, and then they see how fair we treat each other, like when Chris navigates and I drive or vice versa. That will probably be creating or destroying psychological safety for that person just by observing how the team is operating based on what you said. And I think I've definitely seen that before. Yeah, and I guess what are the other examples you've seen where this kind of model helps break down the kind of explanation?
Well, I talk a lot about the safety. First of all, I should say that this is not my model. This is a model that comes from the Academy of Brain-Based Leadership.
Okay.
So it's a model that has been tested. It's fully backed by neuroscience. I just happen to like the model. I find it very useful because it's tangible. We can say, here's the things that make up psychological safety. We don't have enough security. We don't have enough social standing. We don't have enough trust. We can start to do this. Whereas if we just say, oh, psychological safety, it feels good, do more of it, that's not helpful. That's not actionable. We can't do anything concrete and actionable about that, which is why I tend to explain this model to a lot of people, because I want there to be actions that we can do to actually make us better.
Right. So for an environment where feedback and criticism flows freely and people are not afraid to do that, like feel unsafe to do that, then focusing on what I would call like a leading indicator rather than a lagging indicator of the amount of feedback shared between people. The leading indicator would be um, creating activities around building security for people, autonomy for people, fairness, esteem, trust, and focusing on individual uniqueness. And so I like it. Like, I keep kind of going back to that 40X book and the working on the leading indicators to affect your lagging indicators. And I think it's a really good way of putting that. And so if you want to affect psychological safety on your teams so that your products end up being better because the free flow of information leads to a better product, then that, security, autonomy, fairness, esteem, trust, and focus on individuals' uniqueness
Hmm.
for you. That makes sense because I think you can say, okay, do people feel secure in the work that they're doing? Now, I think the whole industry, the whole software industry right now, a lot of people are feeling not as secure as they had in the
Right.
past. Um, and so there's probably going to be like the lagging indicator where the entire industry might feel the negative side effects of that lack of security. Um, it's interesting because like autonomy, like you'd think, oh well, joining a mob, maybe that means that the person's less autonomous. So when you talk about autonomy there, how would you explain it from the standpoint of, you're creating this independent interdependency with other people on your team? Does that affect your autonomy, or is there some other aspect of it to focus on?
Well, theoretically, it would mean that have less autonomy because you're
Right.
working within the mob. There's going to be more rules. There's going to be more structure to it. But in practice, I find that that gives everybody the opportunity to say, well, let's try this thing
Mm,
and let's move forward with this. And it's an experiment. And when you do that, we're giving people more autonomy.
right.
Although, in theory, it would be less autonomy. In practice, I find it's actually more.
Yeah, that's an interesting point because I think I've observed that where somebody would be unwilling to try something on their own, mainly because maybe they fear reprimand from their teammates. I think pull requests are a really good example of this. I put in a pull
Hmm.
request. I just want to satisfy the person that's reviewing my pull request, and so I'm super anxious about whether or not it will make it into the code base versus, hey, we're in a mob. The person that would normally pull request me, with me is right next to me. Hey, what do you think about, adding this pattern here? Oh, that's an interesting idea. Let's try it out. And so yeah, so that is a kind of an interesting twist because you do get this I guess like there's a shared confidence between the people
Hmm.
versus a individual confidence which might not be as built up or as able. And then
Right.
a comment on fairness, I'll just say is you don't realize that people on a team of individual contributors, uh, those individual contributors might have a very unfair playing field
Hmm.
when working together. And so, I've certainly seen people working on production issues their entire workday and then working only overtime to then produce the product later. And where other people were going home, early and part of it was just a focus on quality and there was a lack of understanding about how one person operated versus the other. And when you mob together, it's like, oh, hey, let's put a test here, and then it doesn't break. Oh, wow, I didn't know you could do that.
Hmm.
Um, Stuff like that. So cool stuff.
Absolutely.
Nice. Yeah, a few things that jump out to me is you're right. It does seem counterintuitive that autonomy would increase with mobbing. It seems like it would be less because mobbing does seem to restrict it in some ways, especially when you're first learning it or you're new with the team. Um, but there might be a distinction between kind of local autonomy versus
Hmm.
full system autonomy, right? So
Yes,
if I'm a solo
definitely.
developer or individual contributor, my local autonomy might be very high. Like I can do whatever I want on the IDE and on my machine. But
Hmm.
given the context I work in, it might take 10 gates for whatever I do individually to get to production or whatever, or 3 or something else, right? Whether that be code reviews or manual test phases or all that kind of stuff. Where when you're in a mob, or maybe that's even teaching others, hey, I learned this cool new thing and I want to teach someone else it. If you have a mob and the whole system's in the room, you can, whatever it is that you want to be autonomous about, my idea to get to production, my idea to impact someone else and they learn from it, my, et cetera, you achieve full system autonomy very quickly
Hmm.
in a mob versus solo. I don't know, that's something that jumped out to me on that. And I
Yeah,
think I
it's a
just,
lot easier to
yeah,
step up
please go
and
ahead. Yeah,
propose something as well if the team is with me. If it's
right.
just me with this idea, that's one thing. But if the whole team thinks this thing, because
Hmm.
we have this casual environment where we can talk about it, particularly if we have to escalate something outside the team.
Hmm.
We have to take something to another team, to a manager. It's a lot easier if the team talked about it and said, we're going to do this thing. That's just granted me more autonomy.
Yes. Yeah, yeah. Right on. Very good. Yeah.
Um,
And go ahead,
oh,
Chris.
yeah, I just want to jump in. So for the why in you, do you have any examples of what that might look like in a mob where it is, something in particular that is unique to a person that can affect safety in that way, or any
Well,
thoughts on
the
that?
the why is the mob's not going to directly help the why simply because it is all of those things that are unique to you. But we
Uh-huh.
all bring things to the environment that are some are positive, some are negative, but we're all bringing things into the environment, and
Hmm.
the mob can make it easier to deal with some things.
Right. Okay.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if somebody had, concerns about I don't feel comfortable escalating this thing, oh, the mob can help you with that.
Right. Right. Right.
So
Mhm.
even though that was your personal bias and you had a struggle with that thing, the team has got your back and is able to help you with.
Okay. Cool.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Yeah. And I'm not sure, maybe this is more of a follow-up question. The way I took you initially when you said it is, um, for me personally, let's say I'll pick something somewhat random, but let's say security, autonomy, fairness, esteem, and trust are all very high. But for me personally, to have psychological safety, I need something else. Maybe it's a certain size monitor, or I
Hmm.
can see the other people's faces, or certain ergonomics, or something else that not necessarily one of those things, but something very specific to me personally. I don't, is that something that would fit in the U or the
Well, it
Y
might
category? Okay.
if
Yeah.
those things are required just to make you happy, then not necessarily. But if they're needed to make you feel more safe, then yes,
Right.
absolutely.
Right. Gotcha.
If you
Yes.
feel unsafe without them, okay, they only gave me a tiny monitor. I'm annoyed about that, but I'm not necessarily feeling unsafe because of that.
Yes. Yes. Cool.
Right.
Nice.
Yeah. They didn't give me a camera, but everybody else has a camera, and so maybe I don't. There's something along those lines, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
Or,
that's
I'm
probably
in
a
an
fairness
environment where
item.
people
Yeah.
started to bring their dogs to work and I'm
Right.
afraid of dogs.
Right. Right.
That's very definitely an unsafe environment type
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. I've actually seen that one
Yeah.
with in-person mobbing. Um, yeah. So another thing that I love about this model, this safety model acronym, is it might give more analysis for retrospectives or breaking down when
Hmm.
teams are struggling with psychological safety. Because before it's just kind of like, this psychological safety thing, it just doesn't feel right. Something feels off. But this almost kind of gives us like a checklist, kind of like, okay, where's
Right.
our security at? Where's our autonomy at? Where's our fairness at? And then someone will be like, that's what's wrong. I saw, Austin treat Chris unfairly, and I'm struggling to overcome with that. We need to talk about that,
Hmm.
or, whatever it is. I've seen it before too, where, and this might be part of the why, the U, is that certain levels of chaos in a mob can destroy the security, right?
Hmm.
The predictability of what the mob session is like. So if every 30 minutes, just drawing from one experience I had where we were a mob that supported 20 to 30 different products, and it might have just been a, interesting time where all 20 of those products wanted something. And so it felt like every 20 minutes, someone was interrupting the mob to ask for something or ask a question about something.
And that's
And
a perfect example of security.
right,
We've
yeah.
lost our ability to predict what's going to happen.
Yeah, exactly. So what we did is we increased security by having like office hours where the mob could be interrupted, and then office hours where like, hey, we need to work and get stuff done. And unless something is on fire, it's kind of like do not disturb the mob mode. And and so I've seen that with, team switching can be good, but for certain people, you know, switching too often could destroy the security because it's unpredictable, or at least not predictable
Hmm.
yet, or something like that. And so discovering where your security is destroyed is an important thing. Yeah, I guess, do you have any other examples of where you've seen breaking down a problem in terms of this helps retrospect or
Well, I find that just
troubleshoot?
talking about it and walking people through the model flips everybody
Yeah,
into a more rational, logical way of thinking.
yeah.
And it tends to calm people down. So if they were stressed at the beginning, they tend to become a little less stressed because
Mm,
now I can put a name to it. And we can actually show from a psychological perspective that putting a name on a problem makes the problem less. This is a
mm,
known thing. It's like therapists deal with this. Let's put a name on this thing. It's going to make you feel better. And I
yeah,
know it sounds crazy, but that is the reality.
yeah.
So if I can put a name on it, I've given you six categories, well, five main categories in this catch-all. And now all of a sudden I've put a name on some of the things that you're feeling. Now we can go back and identify and see what's going on. So I do introduce this. I find this model to be the most actionable of the models I deal with. I also do talk a lot about polyvagal theory, but that's far more abstract. And if we're getting into polyvagal theory, I can tell you about, you're moving into the yellow model or you're moving into red and you're having a fight or flight response, but there's no actionable, just do this thing and you'll start to feel better. Whereas with the safety model, we can say we need to build trust. We need to build your social standing. We need to make you feel more secure in what you're doing. We need to fix those fairness issues. We need to make the environment more predictable. So here's some actionable, concrete things we can do.
Nice, nice.
And it's not just, oh yeah, go and feel better now.
Yeah, one more thing maybe before we transition topics is um, the when you were describing what happens when safety is not in place, uh, prefrontal cortex
Yes.
being limited.
The
I've
prefrontal cortex
definitely
gets inhibited
inhibited.
depending on how unsafe we feel. It might be completely shut down, or it might only be partially shut down. But
Yes.
that prefrontal cortex is responsible for so many of our reactions.
Yeah.
It does all of our high level analytical thinking, but it also allows us to overcome biases. So, for
Mm,
example, we all have this natural bias that we don't trust people who are different from us. But
mm,
when our prefrontal cortex is working well, we can override that and say it's okay that this person is from a different culture, a different whatever, because I know that they're still a decent person because the prefrontal cortex overrides that. When our
mm,
prefrontal cortex is inhibited, we feel we can't do that. And so now we have more racism and we have more sexism and we have more of everything else because we can't override those biases. We've lost
mm,
the ability to do that when our
mm.
prefrontal cortex got taken down.
Gotcha, gotcha. Yeah.
right.
Yeah, and I think it's maybe vaguely related, but it reminds me of system one and system two in
Hmm.
thinking
Very
fast and
connected.
slow, right? Where when safety is not there, it's very hard. Like I can just like I can reflect and think back to experiences where I'm trying to think, but it's very hard to think because it's like my body is just trying to kick into automatic habit mode. Like just
Right.
do things to get out of the bad thing that's happening right now, you know?
Yes. When we have a harder time turning on system two when we are lacking psychological safety.
Yeah. Okay.
So
Yeah.
we're doing more system one responses and cognitive bias. That's all system one.
Right. Right. And sometimes system one is very good if your habits are good, but if your habits are bad, it could be very bad.
Hmm.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So,
All
okay.
right.
Uh,
Well, it's probably a good time to change topics in interest of time. So team flow states and brainwave activity during
Okay,
mob
so
versus
this is a
pairing.
much smaller topic than the previous
Okay.
one, so we'll catch up some time here. There's a really interesting paper that was published. This is
Hmm.
an actual uh, neuroscience paper where they did analysis of people that were working solo, people that were working in pairs, and people that were working in a mob. And they were actually monitoring brainwave activity. I believe I can't remember if it was an MRI or if it was an EEG, but the point is they were monitoring brainwave activity as they were going through all of this. And they came to some interesting conclusions. They found that shared learning caused people to feel less anxious.
Hmm.
So this all ties into psychological safety and all of that. So shared learning specifically. They found that mobbing and pairing required higher levels of concentration than working solo. which is the reverse of what you probably expected. It was the reverse of what I expected. I expected that working alone, I would have a higher level of concentration. And when I had a partner with me, I would sort of, step back a bit and I wouldn't be having the same level of concentration. But that's not what the research shows. The research shows that our concentration is at a higher level for both pairing and mobbing than it is for individual work.
Is, could that be related to managing your interpersonal relationships while focusing on the work at the same time, or is
It
it
could be.
more concentration on the work? Like you're just more alert, right? Because, and possibly because you want to make sure that you're behaving well around your colleagues while you're, you know, okay, I gotta not pick my nose or something. Like,
Yeah, it's entirely possible. The studies doesn't get into the points
yeah,
of exactly why they were doing it. It was
yeah.
just we noticed that when people are working in this way, we're able to measure brainwave activity, and we see that levels of concentration are higher at this point.
Mhm.
Fascinating. Um, yeah, and so this is going, I think we'll have to get the link to that. Do you have a link to that paper or study?
Yeah, we'll send you a link
Okay.
to the paper.
Okay, cool. That'd be great to get access to that. And like Chris said, my mind immediately jumps to, I wonder why this is the case. But I guess the paper is probably more just about what was observed, right? Because that's easier
Yes.
to capture.
And they were very clear in the conclusion that they said much more research is required here.
Yeah.
This is an
Yes,
early paper to try and identify some things.
right.
But the fact that they're doing this kind of research around mobbing at all is fabulous.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Well, we'll have to add it to, we have a Trello board of resources, and then there's one card in there where we're collecting all academic studies directly related to mobbing or vaguely related to mobbing. And so this would be good thing to add to the list. Yep. And Trello card.
So
Yeah.
yeah, you know, in that so I can totally understand why concentration levels will be higher. Also, I do think that, when there's a culture of unit testing or other XP practices, right? I think one thing you can observe is that people will be more, I think, generally self-conscious about the amount of testing that they do. And so I don't want to look bad by not suggesting a test. And so, that's sort of maybe a less safe thing, but still a interesting side effect of that because, again, I think, you know, the 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 conversation about what builds I don't know, esteem for someone changes because based on, what the appropriate behaviors are. When you're working alone, maybe your boss only ever sees the amount of code you put out, for customers, but maybe when working in groups, you also you might be focusing on a higher level of quality. Maybe the leadership in that organization cares about different things even.
Mm-hmm.
And so you might concentrate on better habits rather than like making assumptions about how to move things faster by skipping on certain tests where you know the area well or something. So,
We
Yeah.
could just generalize that to taking shortcuts. We
right,
take a lot more shortcuts when we're working in solo
right.
than we do when we're pairing or mobbing.
Yeah, so it could be a social impact, or it can just be a like I'm more aware because I'm thinking about this, or just throwing around the ideas as well. So yeah, that's an interesting thought. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, the something else that jumps me out to, again, it's more speculation, not based off an academic study, but kind of a putting on more philosopher education of philosophy or philosophy of education hat. It would be, I believe that it's probably a cultural stereotype that people like to work conversationally is only for extroverts. Probably because what they're thinking of is working controversially on or working on something collectively with 5 people that I don't know and don't trust would
Mm-hmm.
only work for a wild extrovert. However, if safety is established using that full acronym, even for someone who's doesn't like jumping into random, work situations with people they don't know, if those things are established, it appears to be kind of a common human nature thing that working conversationally untaps learning, untaps experimentation, untaps growth, untaps, kind of brainstorming and new ideas. And I think I can at least say it for myself from a just sharing perspective, that the ability to be unblocked with whatever I'm working on tends to go much better conversationally. So if I'm talking to someone else and working through it, and even if I am alone, if I work alone in a conversation with myself, I tend to do better than just kind of grinding it out as if I were like a processor.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if there's anything there, but that's kind of what comes to mind for me.
Well,
Yeah.
there is a lot of research into the phenomena that we often refer to as rubber ducking, where when
Mhm.
you speak out loud, you actually get better results. They did a study with kindergarten kids that they asked them to explain a thing, or they asked them to do an activity by themselves. They asked them to do that activity while they were explaining to their mothers what was going on. And even with kindergarten kids, we see the same behavior. You get better results when you talk it out loud. You just say the words. Nobody has to be listening. This is why it's rubber ducking, right? Or the teddy bear. You're talking to an inanimate object, but it's the fact that you used your words gives you better results.
Fascinating. Fascinating.
Yeah,
Okay.
kind of a general, we call it sort of a rule as people are mobbing in our environment, but generally speaking, all code must be verbalized first before going into the computer, right? So that might be high level verbalization or low level, but as long as there's like constructs like design patterns available to do that. And so I think that's also like a skill that I think people don't build up ever, right? So if you're,
Mm-hmm.
going through college and writing code, you're never actually saying any of it out loud, maybe unless your professor asks you. That might infrequently happen. And so this idea of regularly having to verbalize code, I think, can just generally make people a better developer, even with that.
Just a
Nice.
quick example, there is a university in the US, Duke University, I believe, where they have a teddy bear in the corner of the computer science lab. And before you're allowed to go and ask a human for help, you have to explain your problem out loud to the teddy bear. This is actually part of their process. And more often than not, people solve their own problem.
Yeah. Right.
That's hilarious. Well, yeah, my mind is kind of exploding with connections and places to explore, but we are starting to hit the end of our time box here. And so I guess before we close it down, is there anything else you'd like to share or plug, Mike, before we end this episode?
Well, I do have a number of blogs. Why I have more than one is a question I ask myself regularly. But I do have three different blogs. I will send you a link that is a page of links to all kinds of things that I talk about, including many of the things we've discussed today, the safety model, polyvagal theory, a whole bunch of other stuff, plus links to my blog. So I'll send you that if you can put that in the show notes. I am an
Mhm.
independent coach. It's worth calling out. I am available to help wherever.
Fantastic, fantastic. Thank you so much for Mike for being on the show. I certainly learned a lot, and I really appreciate that. And to our audience, please like, subscribe, share, to continue the conversation, to continue learning, continue the innovation, experimentation, whether it's about different ways of, first experimenting with mobbing on a team, whether it's jumping into psychological safety and the neuroscience of that, or going into different flow states and versus mob versus pair versus solo. And we'd love to hear your opinions, your thoughts. So please reach out to us on LinkedIn, X, and more. And the comments on YouTube would be great as well. We'd just love to hear what you think and your opinion on this topic. But until next time, mob on everybody and have a good one. See ya.
Bye, everybody.